We'll begin in 1 minute just to allow everybody to assemble online, and as we're collecting the participants, we'll begin in 1 minute. Thank you. Well, Felipe, I know that people are still joining us, but I also know your time is limited, so perhaps we should get going. If you're okay, we can begin the program. It looks as if everything is up and running, and fortunately, we are doing this from Washington, D.C., not from Texas, where I understand that the electricity and everything else is still a problem. So, but we're grateful to have this opportunity, no doubt. Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Council of the Americas for this program with Carlos Felipe Jaramillo, who of course is the Vice President for Latin America and the Caribbean at the World Bank. The program is entitled, Now What? Building Back After COVID. My name is Eric Farnsworth. I run the Washington office of the Council of the Americas and the America Society. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to be your host for the program today. This will be a moderated conversation with our principal guests. So in the second half of the program, you'll have the opportunity, to the extent you care to ask questions of Felipe. To do so, please send me a private chat on the chat function of the WebEx, and I will endeavor to add you to the queue, and then we'll ask the question on your behalf. In terms of the address, it will be to the host and presenters, so please take note of that. This is an on-the-record conversation. We do have press registered, and so we appreciate their interest in our activities as well. As we turn into 2021, and we're already almost at the end of the first quarter, projections are for recovery for Latin America and the Caribbean. That's the good news, especially as vaccines become widely available and widely distributed. But as we all know, the pandemic has revealed and exacerbated some pre-existing conditions across the region, including previously existing sluggish growth, inequalities and inequities, structural challenges in the healthcare space, education, infrastructure, and all the other issues that we have focused on and all know so well. Meanwhile, for all the right reasons, countries are increasing spending to try to address a historically challenging pandemic. But of course, with increased spending becomes the possibility of increased debt and the possibility of financial difficulties down the road. As you might say, it's complicated. So where do we go from here? Well, we've got just the person to be able to answer all of those questions, don't we? That's a setup, Felipe, in the vernacular. But as I mentioned, Felipe Jaramillo is our guest and has graciously agreed to join us for this on-the-record conversation. As the World Bank Vice President for Latin America and the Caribbean, Carlos Felipe Jaramillo oversees bank relations with 31 countries and a portfolio of ongoing projects, technical assistance, and grants of almost 32 billion US dollars. He's a Colombian national. He's been with the bank for almost 2 decades. I first got to know him even before that when he was with the Colombian government, working at a very young age, it must be said, in senior positions in the Colombian Ministry of Finance, the Central Bank, the Ministry of Trade, and the National Planning Department. He holds a PhD in economics from Stanford University, and he's taught economics at the Universidad de los Andes, as well as the University of Maryland here in College Park, just outside of Washington. He is more than qualified to be able to walk us through some of these complicated issues. So Felipe, with our personal thanks for you to join us, we now turn it over to you for your initial comments and look forward to the opportunity to hear what you have to say. Ladies and gentlemen, Felipe Jaramillo. You'll have to unmute. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eric, for that kind introduction. And thank you for this invitation to share with you and with the Council of the America Society. I've been discussing with friends from your organization for quite a long time, and it's a pleasure to be. I think this is my first time formally speaking to you in this new capacity as Vice President of Latin America. Okay, so you gave an excellent quick summary. Let me just then expand a bit on your themes, Eric. I will start, I will breeze through a very quick presentation just to show you, just to make some general points. And so I'm in a nutshell, the first half is going to be bad news. I'm hoping the second half, which is more forward-looking, will have the better news, and we can think a bit more about the future, because I do think our region has a tremendous amount of potential. Good. Can you see the presentation now?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay. Good. So I'm going to breeze through. I'm not going to go into tremendous detail, but as I said, let me first tell you where we think we are, and where we are is not a great place. Where we are at this point is, let me see, page down. Are you seeing a change in the slide? Not yet. Okay, here we go. So we know that Latin America is facing its worst crisis in over a century. We don't have, actually, since we've been having data on economic indicators, we've never seen anything like this. Our best estimate of last year, 2020, closed at around minus 6.9% overall collapse in the GDP, and we had never seen anything like this. And our region, at least among the developing regions, is the one that is seeing the worst impact. I think, as you can see now, here is comparing all the different regions around the world, and Latin America has been the worst hit for reasons that I think we'll need to do a lot of research on why it hasn't hit the other regions as hard. I think it has a lot to do with the high rate of urbanization in our region. A lot of people in informal setting, the high rate of informal neighborhoods and slums, and the density of our cities that has not helped. And of course, weaknesses in our health systems they were not really fully prepared to handle anything like this. Then we have bad news on the poverty front. We estimate about 30 million new poor in the region, maybe a bit more. The numbers are still coming in. And also not just new poor, but a good chunk of the middle class and the vulnerable populations that were caught in between the middle class and the poor have all, significant chunks of them have seen very steep collapses in their income and their welfare. It is spread throughout the distribution, but sadly, of course, the poor and the bottom 50% suffers the most. I am particularly concerned with the inequality. I think many of you might have seen the numbers. I'm trying to show the inequality graph. I don't think you see it yet. Here it is. No, this is the poverty number. Here's the inequality graph. Our latest estimate is that inequality levels have spiked up sharply. So we have lost, we had been seeing actually an extremely positive and trend since the year 2000 across the region. There's been a fairly noticeable drop in inequality. I'm not saying we have beaten inequality, but given that we were the region with the worst inequality record, it has been a significant improvement. Just this year, I think we're losing about 10, 12 years in progress. We're going to get back to levels that we hadn't seen since 2007. And we will unfortunately continue to be the most unequal region in the world with this reinforcement of the trend. Very sad news on what has been happening on the schooling side. I think you all know we see pervasive school closures everywhere, and we our education team is telling us that we feel that the vast majority of kids have lost at least a year of actual learning, and which is going to show in the testing, and it's going to show in a number of things. And we're very concerned about what this could do for future earnings of our youth going forward. We really need to think of some remediation to try to accelerate the learning of all the kids in school to avoid this. And sadly, again, on the inequality front, the ones at the bottom are seeing the worst impacts on their learning. We all know that we have particular groups that have done traditionally worse. Women is an issue that we've been seeing progress in recent years, but with the pandemic, as you can see here, they're the ones who've been facing many more job losses and income losses than men. And I must say it's the same thing for other disadvantaged groups in the region. That this pandemic and its impact has spread much more strongly in the more disadvantaged groups, and whereas the top 10% of the population have actually dealt well with it and have the impact has been rather small. It's the bottom 20% that has really borne the brunt of the impact. Turning now to the subject of public finances, of course, all countries have tried to do their best to respond with packages, particularly social transfers. I'm very happy about that. That the region had invested. Most countries had invested in good social transfer programs to get to the bottom of the bottom and to try to help at least with the extreme poor and the poor. And also SMEs and employment to try to replicate a bit of what the rich countries have done in keeping jobs. Of course, no Latin American country has the fiscal heft of the US or the Europeans. So the programs have been much smaller than proportionally than we have seen elsewhere, but it is being reflected in higher debt to GDP ratio across the board, on average about 10% increase. And that, of course, it has a very different impact across the countries. Some countries were in very good shape fiscally. I'm thinking of particularly, say, Chile and Peru, and they've been able to afford this without tremendous worries. Others really were not in very good fiscal shape, and so they've had to mount these programs by reallocating and taking from one pocket and putting it into the social programs in much, much tougher situation. And we see a lot of different situations across the board. So let me take a moment to explain what I call the pandemic dilemma. So we are going through this very bad situation. It's not over, unfortunately. It will take a few more months. It's very hard to know exactly when, but distribution of vaccines and getting the vaccines into people's arms will make a huge difference. But we don't see this happening. I don't see this happening anytime in this first semester in a significant amount. I think this will probably be a trend that will gain momentum in the second half, but I'm afraid that I think most countries will really only see significant amount of its population vaccinated until 2022. That's the reality we're hearing from the countries themselves about the availability of vaccines. But to the point, the pandemic dilemma is, so I hear people saying we hope we can reestablish order, go back to the status quo quickly, let's get back to 2019. But others say no, but wait, let's rethink 2019. 2019 was not a great year. Actually, the previous 6 or 7 years, the economic and social indicators were not good. The region had a generalized slump. Per capita growth rate over that previous decade of barely 0.4%, while most other regions of the world were growing a lot more. So I call this the pandemic dilemma, that we really need to help the countries get onto a new path and to rethink. That's why I call my talk to rethink and to chart a new course. It's really not about going back to where we were before the pandemic. I think the important thing is to move forward and to think of how Latin America can really unlock its much stronger potential. And particularly because if we continue with the status quo and business as usual, our projections suggest that we will not regain the pre-pandemic GDP until 2023. And if we calculate this on per capita terms, per Latin American citizen, it won't be until 2024 on average. And then for a number of countries, it will be 2025 and 2026. So we will have lost really, if you add up pandemic and the pre-pandemic mediocre period of growth, a number of countries had close to zero, some negative per capita growth. We will have a whole lost decade in per capita income and all social indicators. Poverty had been stagnant for the previous 6 or 7 years. Poverty has now increased, bringing this down. And employment, we've lost at least 25 million jobs in the region over the last year. So I think this really presents a big case for rethinking. Okay, so rethinking in which direction? So I'm going to summarize very quickly the areas that I and my team at the World Bank have been thinking of supporting the region on these rethink. And of course, it varies a lot by country, but let me make some general statements of areas where we think then the region really needs to move forward, needs to adopt new measures, new policies, reforms. So first big area is productivity. So I had a graph here just showing that one of the things that really gets my juices flowing is that Latin America is still at the bottom of the pile among all developing regions, except with the exception of sub-Saharan Africa in terms of productivity. Our region has been just growing very, very low, and it has tremendous potential to grow a lot more. So how do you get productivity up? When you really need to focus on key areas that other countries in other regions have focused on to make sure that there's productivity. And there's quite a few areas, and it varies a bit by country, but I'll single out 3. So number 1 is digital. Because we are convinced that the future is digital and the jobs of the future are all digital in some shape or form. And the sad situation is that today only about half of Latin Americans have access to broadband. And that really doesn't position the bottom 50% of Latin America to face these challenges of the future. So we need to make a very big push on access to broadband. I think that's number 1. And then number 2 on skills. There's efforts going on across, but and making sure that these skills really get also to the bottom of the pyramid. Second point is access to finance. This is an old agenda that we've been pushing for some time. Still, in a good number of countries in the region, a lot of the population does not have access to simple, short-term loans. Loans for micro and small enterprises are very hard to get. in many places. But we are seeing again, and maybe it's part of this new technology that and digital trends, is that we are seeing fintech. These brand new companies and brand new methods to offer small loans. I think there's a lot of potential here, and we need to push that agenda because it also is going to be more inclusive. And then finally, something that we know, Latin America, for long reasons in history, it has been one of the regions, maybe the region with the most regulations, the highest regulatory burden on the private sector in quite a number of countries. And it hits particularly SMEs. And also we're also very well known across the region for having markets that have no contestability. In other words, important markets where there's only one or two companies, and it's really impossible to compete with them for either regulations or lack of competition and lack of enforcement of good competition standards. And we need to work on this because we are convinced, I am personally convinced, that the recovery needs to be led by the private sector. This is not going to be led by the government. In Latin American economies are private sector focused. So we need to spur investment, we need to spur job creation, and we just need to let the private sector do what it does best. Let's see, where am I? 1 second. Okay, trade. I do want to make a very quick reference to trade in that our region has a tremendous amount of potential, but across all regions, we only trade 47% of GDP. If you add up all the imports and exports, we are much lower than the OECD at 85%. Asia, its overall trade is over 100% of GDP. Our potential is still there. We really need to attract a lot more investment in particularly in exports. There is a lot to do, and I think trade barriers and trade facilitation efforts are things that we need to look towards the future. Okay, second area is, of course, human capital. This is very big for us at the World Bank. I won't go into tremendous amount of detail, but just to tell you that on the health side, we've discovered that our health systems have a ways to go. The pandemic has laid bare some critical weaknesses. We still have access problems. We still need to work a lot on quality. And the same goes for education. Aside from, I was mentioning that we are losing a year, perhaps more, in education learning across the whole the gamut of primary, secondary, and college. But also the structural problem we've been facing is that while access has improved tremendously over the last decade, the quality, particularly of public education, and particularly of the education that is accessible by the bottom half of the population, is still has a long road ahead. When we've done some very nice estimates recently of how much kids actually learn, and it's scary how low the actual learning that takes place in some of the classrooms across a number of our countries. Some do relatively well, but many don't. And there's a huge difference among the education quality levels of the top 20% and the bottom 20%, which of course reproduces the inequality of the past. Next slide. Okay, so let me end this quick summary of the things that we need to move on by talking a bit about sustainability. And here I'd like to just briefly mention the importance of focusing on the green growth agenda and the whole climate change discussion. So just to say that, of course, we know Latin America is not really the main culprit of the climate change problem, but we are suffering across the region the impacts of it. We saw these two terrible hurricanes, one after another, following on their tracks recently across Central America. And so there's a lot of destruction. Countries have to invest a lot on resilience and rebuilding and making sure that the building standards are much better than in the past to avoid being wiped out with the next hurricane or the next floods or the next droughts. There's a lot of impacts that are being felt across the region. And many countries are also taking up the decarbonization agenda, which is very good. It's a global public good. It's something that all countries around the world are committed to. And we're trying to support the countries that are thinking of making their growth not only more dynamic, more inclusive, but also greener, more in keeping with these important trends. I think I've covered enough. So my quick summary is we know that this pandemic has fostered an economic crisis of historical proportions. And we know the data are showing us that we really have a real problem in poverty, unemployment, and inequality. And and in my talks with presidents and ministers across the region, what we are really discussing, and many of them are very interested in pushing a rethink, in pushing reforms, and to break with these whole historical patterns. I know it will not be easy. Some countries are still overwhelmed just dealing with the pandemic. That's why we really need the vaccine soon. But I'll leave it at that. Eric, thank you very much.
Well, Felipe, thank you for that brilliant presentation. I've already received several requests for copies of it. I hope you or your staff would make that available. We can circulate that, but thank you for those very important, very sobering comments. Gives us a lot to think about, a lot to follow up on. Let me do so, but before I do, remind folks that if you would like to be added to the queue to pose a question, just send me a private chat and it should go to presenter. So that would be appreciated. But as we kick off our Q&A session, Felipe, I want to follow up with the point that you just ended on, and the phrase "the pandemic dilemma," I believe you called it. I wrote that down. Very clever, very important. And also the question then is, at the political level, you mentioned you're having conversations with people about this, but are you getting uptake of the idea? Are people seeing the urgency here? Because, the point you made that if we return to 2019, well, sure, that's better than where we are now, but 2019 sure wasn't the best year for LATAM and the Caribbean as well. So we have to, in some ways, rethink. We have to be bolder in our ambition, no? And the question is, are folks at the political level able to have those types of conversations and look ahead, or are they still consumed by the immediate crisis of the day? And perhaps it must be said by the pending election cycle in a number of countries. What would you say along some of those lines?
Eric, no, it's a good point. So in a nutshell, the responses are varied, and I think the irony, maybe what I will share with you all is the irony is I see more interest in pushing this idea forward of charting a new from the countries that are in some of the deepest problems. And I'm talking here just to give you an example, Ecuador. Ecuador has been living through macroeconomic massive difficulties from before pandemic times. And they've had already embarked on some very important structural reforms across the board, because they knew that they had fiscal problems, they knew they have competitiveness problems, and I think the government of President Moreno has moved forward on that, and the pandemic has given them even more energy to move on these. So it's a bit ironic. Countries that are a bit more comfortable and do not feel the pressure to move, it needs to be more self-driven. I guess in that boat, I would put Colombia. I've been impressed with, they have this big push for a new internationalization of the economy. They're pushing forward also on infrastructure. So there seems to have in some countries, a lot of thought that had been coming before the pandemic. They're using the pandemic and the opportunity of the crisis to push forward. In every country is different, and I do acknowledge there are some countries that are having serious problems just dealing with the overwhelming health and social crisis, and it would be very hard for some of those to move forward. And as you said, the politics, the electoral cycle is going to play in very different ways in different countries. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, good points. And your reference of both Ecuador and Colombia, I think, is spot on. And from the outside, from the investor community, we've taken a look at many of the positive steps that the Moreno government has made in Ecuador, and I don't think they get enough credit for some of the things they've been doing. So very well stated. And of course, there are variances around the region, as one would anticipate for a region as broad, diverse as LATAM. And the Caribbean, no doubt. So let me follow on that as well from the investor perspective. You know, there's a lot of interest, and we hear a lot from some of your sister institutions as well as the private sector about supply chains and using LATAM and the crisis perhaps to rethink some of the supply chains and to more fully integrate LATAM into the global supply chains, whether it's with North America, whether it's with Asia, Europe, et cetera. And, you know, there's a lot of rhetoric around that and a lot of ambition, but sometimes the reality on the ground changes people's minds, as you were alluding to, I think, in your presentation. And I wonder if you would have any advice for people looking to try to integrate supply chains more fully with LATAM, trying to increase the percentage of trade that is represented in Latin American and Caribbean economies. How should we be viewing this to make sure that this isn't just a fad or a passing phase, but actually investment flows, supply chains are developed, and Latin America becomes more fully integrated in the global economy?
Thank you, Eric. That's a very big question. So, number one, it's very clear that Latin America as a whole had missed the boat when these global value chains became a very dynamic way to integrate into global trade flows and a source of major growth. Of course, in Asia, this has been behind the tremendous success of a number of countries. I think in Latin America, Mexico probably has been the country that benefited the most of this trend. Costa Rica to some extent, a little bit in Chile, elsewhere, but we really missed the boat. So the question is, what comes next, and how can the region connect to this? So there's a lot of talk about potential nearshoring, and if that happens, I think that would be very welcome. But I'm discussing with many of the governments and pushing through the idea that they need to act on this agenda. It's not something that's going to come out of the blue and rain on you. Still cost of getting merchandise out, the still cost of trading generally is not low in many of the countries, and that will require both moving on regulations and moving on key pieces of infrastructure. I think the country, the oomph behind the trade agenda has been lost, and I think we need to recover that. Otherwise, it's going to be very hard to. But I do see a number of countries. I won't quote them because I don't think they're doing this terribly publicly. They are trying to court the nearshoring and new FDI, and I think this is very positive. But it's very important that it's not just selling what they have. They need to also sell an agenda going forward, and that has to include improvements in infrastructure, improvements in regulations, and just a much more open attitude towards being integrated into this global economy.
Yeah, very, very well said. Thank you for your response. I wish I'd love to develop that theme a lot further, and perhaps we can invite you back to do that, but we do have a number of questions that have come in on the queue, so let's turn to some of those. But let's take a rain check, because as you say, those issues are very big, and I know for a fact that companies in North America, in Asia, for example, Japan and other regions are looking very carefully at these issues and want to participate in the recovery of the region. But they need strong partners to be able to do that. So that's at the root of some of my questioning. Well, with that, let's turn to Marian Diaz's question, which I think is a very important one too. You alluded to the employment statistics and job losses. But the question is, presumably the jobs that return aren't going to be just the same jobs. There will be a shift in jobs too, not just numbers, but also in terms of what the jobs actually are, what the sectors are. You alluded to digital. And the question is, do you have any analysis at this point? Maybe it's too early, but where do you see primary job losses being sustained and primary job gains being maintained?
That's a very interesting question, very important. So we have been, even before the pandemic, we've been doing quite a bit of work about the future of work and what does it look like. And the sense I'm getting from our experts is that the pandemic is accelerating this in very important ways. And we don't know yet fully, because it's not clear what will stick, what will not stick, how much of the home-based work, how much of the online e-commerce, but it really has pushed, there's a number of businesses in several countries, this whole delivery, everything being done by delivery instead of people going out shopping. We expect that a good chunk of that is likely to stay. I think overall the services industry and the one that really uses platforms and digital will probably continue to have a boom. And some of the more traditional sectors that are more manual and do not use these new technologies. So I think there's an opportunity there that Latin America needs to grab. So Eric, you know that I spent the last 2 or 3 years in East Africa. I just came back 6 months ago from living in Nairobi. I was impressed at how the economies of East Africa, especially the Kenyas of this world, had leapfrogged and gone from money payments, cash payments, to almost everything done by phone. Everybody using digital currency, everybody having access to loans through their phones. Clearly an energy and enthusiasm of the young people there to start to do startups and to think differently. We need to do a lot more of that, Latin America, because I think this new platforms offer a possibility of leapfrogging, which is exactly what we need to think differently and to move forward. So it's not a complete answer because I don't think we know exactly which will be all the jobs, but we need to be monitoring, and we will need to help countries help those workers who are being left behind. You can't just abandon them. I think there will need to be a lot of digital skilling, a lot of reskilling. We had too much unrest before this pandemic across the region, and so we cannot ignore them. It will be very important to bring them along. That's all I'll say for now.
A follow-up question on that point from Kapil Sharma of Wipro. There are limits on labor mobility around the world, of course, but in the digital sector, you can do a lot of jobs from where you are as opposed to having to go to another country to do them. But the reality is that there aren't enough people in Latin America who are trained in some of these skills to be able to take full advantage of that newly transient workforce or digitally transient workforce. And the question is, how do we merge some of our ambitions on education, job training, skills, investment, so that Latin America can be more fully integrated in the global digital space? I think that goes right to some of the points that you were already making.
That's very well said, and it's precisely what comes to mind when I think about East Africa leapfrogging. They're investing in the skilling and investing in the access. So I would say that's why I want to bring up that point. Right now, there are some sources of dynamism in this across the region. But if you look at who's taking advantage of them, it's not anybody in the bottom 50%. And that's wrong. I mean, we really need to bring everybody to have these opportunities. Whereas in Kenya, for example, I saw a lot of people who had just young people migrated from the countryside, from very humble origins, and very quickly picked up a few skills, and they were building their own apps, and they were being hired by firms to do this kind of thing. So right now, I'm really concerned that until we give access to everybody and until we have a strong universal skilling of everybody on this, the opportunities will only be captured by the top 20% or so. So very important, huge part of the agenda going forward in the short run.
Well, thank you for those comments, and I think it's on the minds of many folks in the private sector, right? I mean, the skills, the jobs exist. The question is, how do you match the skills with the jobs that exist? That's a very important point. Thank you for those comments. We have a number of questions that are country specific, and I know these get a little bit complicated in a public on the record forum. So we'll give you the opportunity to address some of them if you care to, but recognize perhaps some of the limitations you might have. The first is, of course, you would anticipate on Argentina. There are some imbalances that appear to be in the economy, and but you have an election later this year, and the question is, perhaps not a fair one, but I'll pose it anyway. Would you anticipate that the government will attempt to try to muddle through the elections, or would you anticipate some sort of shifts in Argentina's economic management between now and the October elections?
Okay, no, thank you for that. Yes, one of the unfortunate things of having taken over this job during the pandemic is I have not been able to travel. And so so everything is about these kinds of virtual exchanges. But we're following carefully. We have a big presence in Argentina. So in a nutshell, we're following very carefully, and Argentina is an important country for us. We are right now considering a few important financing options for the areas of water, critical sort of social services, water, health, social transfers, and urban transport, which are all very important areas that help the bottom half of the population. I think on Argentina, I would say two more things. So number one is this debt restructuring with private bondholders, I think was a very positive move. It has given some breathing space to the country and set a strong precedence for debt restructurings, which is something that we need to do more of, and it's a kind of tool of the debt architecture, the global debt that we really need to have better developed, because I think more countries, not just in Latin America, I think in Africa and elsewhere, are going to have these problems accentuated because of this crisis. I see some very positive developments on the side of the government. They're putting an increase in capital expenditures in their budget to be able to invest for growth in the future. I think that's it's moving from 1% of GDP to 2% of GDP. This is a country that, because of the fiscal, they have not been able to do too much public investment for growth, and that's a good thing. But on the other hand, they're so constrained. Inflation is already high. They're monetizing a lot of the fiscal deficit, and this is not a good thing in the long run. So bottom line, my final message here is we're cooperating with the government, with the fund, with the IDB. We're watching very carefully the negotiations with the IMF, and we really hope that these negotiations go smoothly. In the next few months, I can't predict the precise month because these are the very important negotiations. I think the best thing is that they reach a successful end, and so that Argentina can safely land and get into the business of recovering. Right now, we have, last year, our best estimate is that the economy shrank by 10.6%. This year, we're estimating they're going to grow by about 4.9%, which means they've only, recovering a bit of the fall. So that economy really needs stability and strong signals so it can keep growing as soon as possible.
Very good, and stated with a diplomat's touch, so thank you for that. Another complicated question in terms of country-specific is Mexico. Look, Mexico is really important to the United States, obviously, and the U.S. private sector, but it's more broadly important for the region as well. Second largest economy, of course, in all of Latin America. But it's the country that seems to have been the most affected by the pandemic, no, in terms of life, citizens' lives, but also negative economic growth, and the two are clearly intertwined. But it does seem to have hit Mexico particularly hard. But the private sector doesn't seem to be investing at this point in Mexico because of some regulatory uncertainty, despite the passage and implementation of the USMCA with Mexico and Canada. It seems to be some regulatory issues, some moves that the government is making, particularly in the energy sector and elsewhere. From the World Bank perspective, if you're looking at Mexico, is there any advice you might be willing to share with us on ways to regenerate growth in Mexico and to restart some of that really important private investment flows that Mexico needs, and frankly, that the private sector, I think, would like to do, but needs to see some different signals?
Okay, well, that's a difficult question. I'm trying to get on top of the. So maybe just to first clarify, they're not the country that has done worse in this pandemic. I think they've had some sources of resilience. I said that overall for the region, our forecast was of a reduction of 6.9. Mexico shrank by 8.5. I have a long list of at least another 10 countries in the region that did much worse than Mexico. So they're not at they could have done worse, and I think they have the resilience that is very much linked. Of course, we all know that, to the U.S. economy, and I think it has been very helpful. Not only that the USMCA is now again a strong and important piece of the relationship, but that the U.S. economy is recovering, with its hiccups, but is recovering fairly well, and that helps a lot. I think what I'm most concerned with, for all countries, but Mexico is, of course, very important. What I'm most concerned with to really resume economic activity and bring some stability. This vaccine, the vaccines need to get there and need to get on people's arms. Mexico actually has been able to announce probably one of the highest number of contracts for vaccines. 236 million doses have been already purchased. And a significant number have arrived. And I think Mexico is a bit a leader in the region on this, and this is very good. And they have very good experience on efficient vaccination. We have worked with them on health programs before. So I am looking to Mexico for Mexico to be a leader in showing the region how this can be done effectively. They're going to have my sense from what I hear is that they will be one of the countries with the most vaccines available earliest. So if they can do that, that will really help improve their stability and their prospects going forward. I think there's a number of areas. We've worked a lot on the south of the country, which, as we all know, is still where a lot of the poverty is disconnected, doesn't really derive the benefits from the trade with the U.S. There needs to be a lot more investment, both on the infrastructure side and on the social side, to make sure that population improves. And then also, generally, the issue of the informality and labor markets. Informality is still very, very high. Access to credit is still, Mexico is a real laggard in the region. So bringing a lot of these people who have been kind of in this gray economy into the main, I think that's a huge challenge for Mexico going forward. And I think they have some good ideas. We're going to be supporting that.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And I hope, from the U.S. perspective, that we in the U.S. will do our part to try to get some of those vaccines to Mexico very, very soon and widely distributed. It's obviously in our own self-interest, so we should do it anyway, but it would also be good for Mexico, in my view. And frankly, what you just said, I couldn't agree with more, so thank you for that. We're going to try to give you softer questions from here on out. Thank you for your willingness to address some of these difficult topics. But we have limited time, about 10 minutes, but I know that we have several more questions. I want to get to two in particular, so we'll try for two, and if there's time, we'll try a third. But there are several questions that have come up regarding Venezuela, not what to do about Venezuela, but the crisis, the humanitarian crisis that is clearly affecting other countries, particularly your home country, Colombia. The Duque administration just offered, citizenship, basically, or at least regularization to over 1 million Venezuelans in Colombia. Very generous humanitarian move. But the question is, these are clearly going to impact the economies. And, what is the World Bank doing, or is the World Bank doing anything to help the surrounding countries, Colombia, Brazil, Guyana, perhaps, although Guyana has lots of new income from oil, but other countries as well. How are you viewing that? What can be done to help alleviate what is really Latin America's largest humanitarian crisis in the modern history?
Yes, big question. So it is something that is in the top of mind for us. And I was very glad to see that we have been involved for the last 2 or 3 years in supporting Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, especially those 3 that have really requested our help because the significant number of migrants that have come from Venezuela. And I think, as you rightly pointed out, this granting of the temporary protection status for the migrants is really quite a progressive move on the Colombian side. And I mean, I'm sorry, I'm Colombian. I don't like to speak well of my country, but this is really, I'm very proud of that, and I think this is fantastic. I think Colombians not only are generally generous people, but I think they're also rational. They see that welcoming this population and helping them adapt and settle and contribute is the best way forward. And we've done a couple of studies in the last 2 or 3 years showing that, yes, there are costs in the short run, and you have to help these people. They have transition costs of settling in. You may need to help with the housing, with some of the utilities. But these people will contribute. These people are contributing already. Most of them are working, some informally because of the lack of these temporary protection status. But Colombia had already given some of the status to a number of the Venezuelans, and we've shown in the studies, it's really fantastic how they've already been contributing, paying taxes. They've already been contributing to health and pension systems. So these are people who are productive and ready to contribute to whatever country that is happy to host them. So I think this is the right move. Aside from doing studies, we're also trying to mobilize financing from the bank and financing from others, because I think this is really a humanitarian thing. It should not go on commercial terms. A lot of this support really needs to be recognized by the international community.
Yeah, absolutely. And you said a bit of my temporary protected status. I couldn't find the word in my head, so thank you for that. No, I knew it wasn't citizenship, but I appreciate your clarification there. And then in the time remaining, we have about 5 minutes, and so we don't have enough time to deal with this question in the way it should be dealt with, but I do think we have to come back to it because there are several who have asked the question about debt sustainability. We talked about it initially in your presentation. You talked about it. Of course, some countries, fortunately, you mentioned Chile, Peru, have, through fiscal discipline, have some space to be able to address some of the social needs brought on by the pandemic. And some countries, of course, are in more difficult conditions. But, what should we be looking for, as we go forward? Are there some warning signs out there? Are there things we should be concerned about? Does the region really have the debt load under control? Are there some red flags or anything? How would you recommend that we look at some of these very important issues that, of course, the World Bank has played critically important roles in alleviating debt and debt sustainability in the region for many, many years? How should we look about those?
Okay, so this is going to be, a global issue, I believe. It's not just a Latin American issue. As I said, I was in Africa. It's being lived out as we speak there. A good number of countries really facing tremendous difficulties making their debt payments. I think our region, Latin America, has the potential of being a leader I mentioned the Argentinian debt, the bondholders restructuring. The Ecuadorian one was also a very good and trendsetter. I think we will need to think very creatively, because I think a number of countries will have some debt repayment difficulties. I'm very concerned, of course, with some of the Caribbean countries, because in many of them, tourism is 30, 40, or 50% of employment and of GDP. And they've taken a terrible hit, and they still don't have access to vaccines, so things are not normalizing anytime soon. I think we will need to think out of the box, and that's why I'm very happy with these restructurings, because they show that these kinds of things were not possible a number of years ago, and so it's one step, but it's probably insufficient. I think my general principle, and maybe I'll finish with this, is we really need to learn the lessons that Latin America showed the world in the 1980s. And that was that we didn't fix the problems quickly. It took us over a decade. And so this debt overhang brought the growth and progress of the region. We lost an entire decade, and in some places even longer, because we wouldn't recognize that some of this debt just needed to have a different treatment. It was either unpayable, and we needed to recognize that it was completely unpayable. So we could pay part. What part did it make sense to pay upfront? What part needed to be rescheduled, and what part needed to be subject to some sort of haircut? So I think we will see situations like this. And we at the World Bank, we will be advocating for the countries and for creative solutions going forward. It won't be easy. It will take some time, but I hope we'll get it done.
A really good place to leave this, where Latin America can actually come out of this as a leader in some way, using examples of the past to inform some of the decisions going forward at a global level. You've also mentioned that in the case of the environment, which I fully concur with. The one area where I personally would like to see a lot more work on would be on the trade agenda and the regional integration, and also the supply chains, and we touched on that. Look, Felipe, you have done a magnificent job. We've pitched a lot of difficult questions to you. You have not shied away from them. You've given us real-time, informed answers. I just want to say personally, thank you for being willing to do that. I hope you'll come back to the council at some point, perhaps for updates. We'd love to have the chance to continue this dialogue with you and your colleagues to learn more about the important work that you and the bank are doing. Certainly, we'd love to be able to do that. With that, I think we should close. I know your time is limited and you have a hard stop at noon. Ladies and gentlemen, this will conclude our program. We are thankful that you have joined us today. We will endeavor to get to you if you care to see it. A copy of Felipe's presentation, we'll get that out probably early next week. And we hope to see you again very soon here at the Council of the Americas virtually, or hopefully before too long in person. Ladies and gentlemen, have a terrific weekend. Be safe. See you soon.
Thank you very much.